Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook. Good Books Radio is a product of the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley as a public service to this community and public radio. With me today is Carina Chocano. She has written for the New York Times Magazine, ELLE, Vogue, New York, California Sunday Magazine, Good Magazine, and Wired, among others. She has been a film critic at Los Angeles Times and a TV critic and staff writer at Entertainment Weekly and Salon. She lives in Los Angeles, and the book is something we all ought to pick up. It's called You Play the Girl. You Play the Girl on Playboy, Bunnies, Stepford Wives, Train Wrecks, and Other Mixed Messages. Ms. Chocano, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is a wonderful read for me in particular because I teach a course in gender and communication. We talk about the first and second wave of feminism, amongst other things, and about sex role socialization. And I was just walking down the hall where we record these programs, and I saw one of my millennial students, and I said, this is a great read for feminists. She said, I don't consider myself a feminist. And I think that's a part of what goes on with the millennial generation. They don't really connect with what the second wave did for them.
That's interesting. I mean, I've felt like there's such a groundswell among young women these days who do call themselves feminists, but I'm sure that it's also varies by region and I'm sure that there's some variation in that. But it's true that there is a kind of a different focus and a different way that millennial feminists, I think, are connecting to feminism.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's start with You Play the Girl. You talked about an interview of the actress in The Wedding Crashers, and she realized, what's her name? Isla Fisher, yeah. She realized that there just aren't many comic roles for women, that mostly they play the girl in the hot rod.
Yeah, that's right. And this interview is from a while ago. It was from 2008, which is around the time when I started really thinking about this book, because it felt like sort of the nadir. And at the time, you really looked around, and it wasn't just that there weren't any any lead roles in comedies for women or comedies about women. But even when a comedic actress who we knew to be hilarious was cast in a smaller role, it was usually a kind of a punishingly humorless role. I remember Sarah Silverman would get cast as the mean executive, and it was just kind of always taken out. Or there was a movie with the woman, now I'm blanking on her name, but the woman from the Gilmore Girls, and just, but never given any of the funny lines. And it was just a moment, I think, where there was a real belief, and it was stated, even studio executives and major newspapers would say it, I mean, even, I don't know if you remember this moment when Christopher Hitchens wrote his infamous "Women Aren't Funny" column. So it was something that at the time, which now seems so absurd, but at the time, it seemed absurd at the time, but somehow it was accepted as something that we could seriously debate. So that was what really kind of spurred me to write it. But it took me a long time to get it together because it didn't. The culture felt very hostile to the message at the time.
Yes, I can understand. And let's talk about the culture in which we're immersed, the patriarchal culture in which we've been immersed, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s as the second wave of feminism emerged. Disney gets a lot of analysis about this because of the stories of the various princesses in the Alice in Wonderland. Let's start with Alice in Wonderland because you spend a good deal of time talking about that. How does that affect women's sex role expectations?
Well, I thought, that Alice in Wonderland was first of all, it was not. She was not a character that I particularly caught into as a child, and the way I sort of rediscovered her was that I found this beautiful edition, and I bought it. I brought it home to my daughter, who was obsessed with Sleeping Beauty and all the princesses, but especially Sleeping Beauty. And we read Sleeping Beauty every single night. And one night, I said, why don't let me read you from this book? And she listened to a few pages and then shut it down, didn't like it at all. And then I went and I read it myself after she went to sleep, and I was really surprised to find how much I identified with Alice. But also also to sort of realize, like, oh, I didn't like her as a child, as a character, and I realized why that was. And I had actually mentioned it to my mom, and she said, I didn't like her very much as a child either. And I think that Alice is a character who, even though she's really beloved now, I think that it's mostly adults who love her, but she's the kind of girl that we're taught is an unlikable girl. She's very, she's curious. She kind of gets in, and she sort of goes where she's not wanted. She talks back. She's emotional. She cries. She's sort of entitled. She thinks she's entitled to things. She's kind of arrogant, and all these qualities that girls, desirous of things, and all these qualities that girls are told make them unlikable. And when I encountered her, I thought, wow, she's really a subject, and it's rare to find a little girl subject, especially in a story that old. And I really also identified with her her travels through Wonderland as a film and TV critic, having spent so much time kind of in this nonsense world where none of the women, these creature women who were presented to me as women made any kind of sense or seemed familiar in any way.
Mm-hmm. Media so much affects how we think and how we behave. And your first chapter about Bunnies talks about that your sexiness came from your grandfather's Playboys and Bugs Bunny in drag. Let's talk about that a bit.
Well, that chapter, so I basically go from reading to my daughter, reading Alice in Wonderland and Sleeping Beauty to my daughter, to sort of jumping back to when I was her age, at around age 6. And my grandfather, who was just a hilarious man, actually had, I now understand it better. I think he really identified at the time, with this kind of madman ethos. Like, he was just really into it. He had his game room with his felt-covered poker table and his, just all his stuff in what you would, I guess, call, like, his man cave or whatever, his bar. And he would get Playboy, and he didn't hide them, he had them like leather bound by year.
Nice.
And they looked like encyclopedias. Mm-hmm. So they were like proudly displayed on the shelf. So we used to, as kids, we used to sneak them off the shelf and go look at them. And I just, and so I was young enough, I think, that just the idea of like looking at these kind of collections of new girls, plus this is like Playboy 1960 to 1974 or something, I think was his collection. Mm-hmm. So they were very like, they just looked kind of like these specimens, like these strange little bunnies in like museum dioramas. And I remember just trying to figure out how to relate to that. Like, it was this strange, almost like a horror movie, body horror. Like, am I going to turn into this and be this bunny in this cage, or is it worse if I don't and then I'm nothing because there's no representation of a grown-up woman who isn't a sexy woman? It was just this whole idea of like women are sexiness and the way that's created and the way I think little girls absorb it, whether you want them to or not. They absorb it from a very young age, because I would say, the very, very large majority of the images we get of women and stories we get about women is about their sexual desirability. Mm-hmm. And so we teach that even pre-verbally and, before you can read it and anything else, you're learning that the most important thing is prettiness. And I've seen it even in my own daughter, who was 6 years old in 2012 or whenever it was. She absorbs it from driving around, from looking at billboards, from looking at the, ad on the bus that goes by. Mm-hmm. And Sleeping Beauty was her favorite because she was the prettiest. And that's definitely something that little girls are taught from it's a very primal thing. It's one of the very first things that they learn.
Yeah, there was a line in this essay about looking at naked girls didn't make you feel powerful. It made you feel like you were visible and negated and exposed. And I think Hefner had it in his mind that if he communicated that nice girls like sex too, that he would be aligned with feminine liberation, but that isn't how it turned out.
No, and it's funny, I learned a lot about Hefner in writing this essay, because I'd had this idea too that like Playboy was part of liberation, and I'd sort of vaguely heard that, and I don't know if he ever claimed that himself, but the more I read, the more I learned that he really thought of himself as sort of an anti-feminist, and as someone who was in direct opposition to feminism. And in fact, when there was a piece on Playboy that there was a piece on the feminist on the women's movement that was assigned to a female reporter that Playboy was going to run, and he killed it because it was too sympathetic to the movement. And his memo was like, these women are natural enemies. So he very much saw himself as constructing an identity that was in direct opposition. And I think that's what also made me understand, like, my grandfather's collection. My grandfather, it wasn't that he was like, this is the reason they weren't really hidden away, and he was like proudly reading the magazine for the articles, in front of everybody. There was a real identity built around that. Like, this is what mid-century masculinity looks like. Mm-hmm. And we've seen it in Mad Men. Now we're all pretty familiar with it.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, because you are of a Hispanic culture, and my wife is Hispanic. Mm-hmm. Was it more traditional roles, expectations in your household?
I always wonder about that. My family's from Peru, and I don't think all Latin American countries are necessarily the same in this, mm-hmm. And I don't think that that they're the same across socioeconomic lines either.
Right.
So it really depends what you mean by traditional, I guess. I mean, my family, yes, the women got married and did not work, but that was also true of the American women of my mother's generation that I knew growing up in the suburbs.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about that a little bit too.
They were not any different in that sense. If anything, they actually, they actually sort of worked less because they had a lot more domestic help. Mm-hmm. So it was a kind of if anything, there was more of I saw a more kind of, I don't know how to put it, but I'm a little bit more of like a kept or queenly existence, mm-hmm. that was just more about like going out with your friends and doing things, being with the kids, but nothing too different, not the hard stuff, and it certainly wasn't like you be quiet, it wasn't like don't speak. I never ever saw that, and in a way that's why the messages are mixed, because I was never told I wouldn't go to college, or that I was never ever told that I wouldn't do something because I was a girl. Mm-hmm. But when I looked out into the world, I was like, well, where are the women doing the things in my world? And I didn't really see them. So it was a much softer expectation. I guess it was a much softer socialization. Yeah. But definitely there was some, of course there's tradition in terms of like, there's a double standard in terms of sex, there was a double standard in terms of like, well, your brother's allowed to go out wherever he wants, but we need to know where you are, kind of thing. Yes. A sort of more protective double standard. Mm-hmm. But not a kind of like women do, not in an oppressive way, or in a way that was very clear and noticeable.
Yeah, I think traditional might have been a bad term. It'd probably be more accurate to talk about patriarchal.
It was like a soft patriarchy, mm-hmm. It's not sort of like, it's not the Taliban, but it's, but it's like, you see, it's soft patriarchy, and it's insidious, and it's denied, and it's, mm-hmm. Is it worse in Latin countries than in, I don't know, in some ways it is, in some ways it isn't, honestly. I think women are actually listened to more in Latin countries.
Okay.
You know?
I don't want to leave out the androgynous cartoon character who's my favorite of all time, Bugs Bunny, because you mentioned him as part of the influence there.
Mm-hmm.
Is his androgyny part of why he sends signals regarding sex role socialization?
I think for me, what's interesting about him is that he kind of occupies this in-between, yes, he's this in-between androgynous space. We assume he's male, of course, and he acts male, you know, in a lot of cases, but he's prey also.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's not the predator, and so he's in the role of the prey. And actually, Hefner had this great quote that I have in the book where someone asked him why he chose bunnies as the symbol, and he said, because in America it's a very sexual animal, it's a playful animal, you know, it comes up to you, it sniffs you, it jumps away, it hops away, you know, you play with it. So there's this whole idea that it's like this sexualized and feminized animal. So it's interesting that this like kind of how would you describe Bugs Bunny? He's this kind of picaresque figure, you know, and so he does have the, you know, these male qualities, but he's in this body that's traditionally coded as the prey and the bunny. Mm-hmm. So he's very interesting that way. So he's able to kind of like move between both. And sure, it's the, you know, whenever they're making those Looney Tunes, it's a long time ago, and so his dressing up as a girl is presented is always a comic thing. But it's really it was fascinating to me to see him basically use his femininity to kind of trick people, you know, and escape these situations. Like that was always the thing. Like if I don't get out, I'm going to get killed if I don't trick this person. So he would trick them with this like exaggerated femininity, and it was always like extremely exaggerated. It was like he's Carmen Miranda, he's a ballet dancer, you know, it was always like some extreme. And I thought that was just so fascinating, like because Bugs as a boy has nothing on, and Bugs as a girl has tons on, like fruit on the head and lipstick, you know, like absolutely every accessory you can pile on him, he has on. So it's like the idea that femininity is all, you know, this thing that you put on is really interesting in that, you know, that's how they present that idea. Like, and that's how all cartoons present it. Like, masculinity is just bare essence, and femininity is just a bunch of, like, accessories.
Mm-hmm. Very good. You also juxtaposed two very different works, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan and Stepford Wives, which was an eerie movie that just scared me when I saw it. The idea that men were going to kill off their wives and make sex bots, robots that were, you know, there for sex and cleaning the house and mindless otherwise was just really eerie. And it also speaks to the issue that often comes up when you read The Feminine Mystique about marriages fail when wives don't try hard enough. And it's just really that really got to me at a gut level.
Well, The Feminine Mystique was published in 1963, and it was actually, you know, Betty Friedan kind of, she was a little older than the generation of second wave feminists, and she had been a labor organizer and a union organizer, and she'd written for the union newspapers and stuff, and and then she was a freelancer for women's magazines, and she was married and living in the suburbs and feeling pretty dissatisfied, and sort of thinking back at her college, her class at college. I can't remember, she went to one of the Seven Sisters colleges, and went back and sort of talked to her friends and found that they had all, you know, they were all like highly intelligent, highly educated women, and who had then, because of the time, been expected to just get married and go live in the suburbs and raise kids. And people think that this is the way things always were, but in fact, you know, that we did have there were a lot of women in the workforce, and it wasn't just during the war or because of the war. But during the war, there had been, obviously a ton of women in the workforce and a network of free government preschools set up so women could work, which is something that nobody seems to know about. But it's like people know that Rosie the Riveter went to work, and no one asks how she was able to do it. And it was like this network of like high quality free daycares that were dismantled after the war by the right, because they thought it would lead to socialized whatever, and that the family should take care of it. So it was very much a right-wing effort to like shut those down and put women back in the home. And so for a lot of women, especially who were highly educated, it was really frustrating. And that was what I think Betty Friedan was sort of identifying. She was like, look, the advertisements tell us that we're so happy vacuuming in our pearls, and meanwhile every woman I know who supposedly has it all and is sort of the affluent ideal, the white affluent bourgeois ideal, is actually miserable. And so I think that's what the Stepford Wives is about, but just in this like campy horror form.
Yeah.
Because Friedan was basically doing a lot of research into how does the media tell us this? How does the medical profession tell us this? Like how has, the mother's little helper thing, like the kind of wave of the rash of depression that there was, and, just how do we even think about women who are dissatisfied with basically doing nothing but free labor in the home. They were just pathologized and told, you're not doing what you're born to do. There's something wrong with you. Whereas in the Stepford Wives, basically what they do is they kill them and replace them with robots who are happy to iron all day and their conversations are like commercials about laundry detergent.
And I have shown the history of television ads and print ads in my gender class, and we look at some of the most ridiculous. I mean, there's this recommendation that you buy the latest vacuum cleaner for your wife for Christmas, and she's almost having an orgasmic experience when she sees what a good, clean house she's going to have, and it just...
Are these old ads from that time?
Yeah, yes, indeed. Indeed. And that sort of touches on another subject that I want, because I wasn't aware of this column until I read it in your book. Can this marriage be saved? That really struck me hard.
That anyone who grew up like in the 70s, and if their mother got Ladies' Home Journal, is obsessed with this column. It was this very kind of a lurid column about it was basically a woman would present her side of the story of the problem she was having in her marriage, and then the man would present his side of the story, and then the counselor would present his side of the story. But the counselor turned out to be this like extreme right wing eugenicist, actually, who was very, very firmly into like, traditional family values. And so the woman was always wrong. Like, she could say, he beats me, and then he would say, well, maybe you should talk less. It was always the answer.
Yes, right, yeah.
Like, what are you saying to piss him off so that he punched you? So the column was like this weird hermetic horror story. It reminded me of the Stepford Wives, because you had this sense of this. You often had the sense of the woman being trapped in this situation, because no matter what was happening, the counselor was saying that she just had to accept it and stay.
Yeah.
Or like there was somewhere, like say the husband didn't want to get married and he wanted, he was into like the free love movement and whatever, and he wanted to move to San Francisco, and the counselor would like force the guy to stay. But then of course that didn't end well.
Right.
So
this all the blame is on the woman, whether it's domestic violence or infidelity or infertility. It's all the wife's fault in these columns. And I didn't know that the Ladies' Home Journal was run by men for years. There were no women writers. Yeah.
Except for Helen Gurley Brown, who is, and she's a somewhat polarizing figure, but she was definitely the only one who was running it, who was a woman running one of these magazines, and doing it from at least her, her perspective. But they were all run by men, and they were all, and they were very much, devoted to the sale of soap and makeup. I mean, that's kind of their purpose. So there's always been a tension that even still exists between, what these magazines write about, which it can be amazing, is amazing often, but compared to what they're often selling. The mixed message is really apparent in women's magazines even to today. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Ladies' Home Journal was run by men. All the senior editors were men except for one. And it was occupied by a group of media women who demanded, kind of had a sit-in and demanded that they start writing about things that women would need to know about, like how. And it was really very prescient. It was stuff like how to talk to your son about the draft, or how to, what kinds of detergents are best to not pollute the rivers and oceans. And
yeah, I love that.
Yeah, really good stuff. That they were dealing with at all, mm-hmm. or how to get a divorce. Mm-hmm. I mean, people don't really know that in 1973. It blows my mind. But I was in kindergarten in 1973. In 1973, if you were a woman with a job, you could be a single woman with a good job, and you couldn't get a car loan. Mm-hmm. You couldn't get a credit card. You couldn't get a mortgage, and those, you depended on a man, any man, like your father, your brother, anybody, to co-sign that. And so you weren't really fully autonomous in the society, and the Equal Rights Amendment almost passed at that time, and then, there was a very big campaign for it not to pass, and we still don't have it. So, it's I think it's something that's, again, it's like this soft patriarchy, and it's something that we don't really look at the effects, but they really are there. We see them all the time.
I only have a couple of minutes left, but since you mentioned 73, I'm going to move to 75 because your favorite shows were Bewitched and I Dream of Jeannie. And how did that impact your life?
I loved those shows so much, and they were so popular, obviously, and they were reruns, so they were already a little bit before my time. I was watching them, after the fact, but they were both about these incredibly powerful women. One's a witch and one's a genie. They can just wiggle their nose or do whatever and just make things happen. And the whole comedy and the whole narrative is about how they're in relationships with men who are trying to control them so that they don't use their power, and how their power is ultimately extremely destructive, specifically to the men and their careers. Mm-hmm. Which is really so interesting in terms of Me Too, if you think about it. I'm thinking about this now. But it's all about, oh my God, Darren's going to lose his job because you're a witch, or Major Nelson's going to lose his job because you're a genie. And yes. And you really, it's just this constant refrain. And, I think fast forward, I don't know how many years, you have Frozen. And what's Frozen about? It's about a blonde princess who's the legitimate heir to the throne of her country. And she has superpowers, and these superpowers are so threatening that her parents lock her away, and she's banishes herself to a mountain. And it's put a boy in that position. It's a king with superpowers. Mm-hmm. What's the problem? Mm-hmm. There's no problem.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's interesting what we've done to disempower women through the years, and this book is a really good read in that regard. We've been talking with Carina Chocano. The book is You Play the Girl on Playboy, Bunnies, Stepford Wives, Train Wrecks, and Other Mixed Messages. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't hear our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can also catch us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening, and make it a great day.